Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Scott Kellogg. Dr. Scott Kellogg is an ISST certified advanced schema therapist who has also received training in both Gestalt therapy and voice dialogue. He created the Transformational Chairwork Psychotherapy Project in 2008, and he currently teaches his method of psychotherapeutic dialogue to practitioners in both the United States and abroad. Dr. Kellogg is also in private practice in New York City, and he has received his doctoral in clinical psychology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and he has served on the faculties of New York University, the Rockefeller University, the Yale University School of Medicine, and Teachers College at Columbia University. He's also the past president of the Division of Addictions of the New York State Psychological Association. In his writing, he has focused on such topics as Gestalt Chairwork, humanistic addiction psychotherapy, and schema therapy. Dr. Scott Kellogg, welcome and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Celeste. Really a pleasure to be here, and a privilege to be here with the Latin American Federation of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. So today I'm going to talk about chairwork and the 4 dialogues and share some of my experiences, some of my ideas about how we can use chairwork to really transform our practices and bring this incredibly powerful tool to our work. So some thoughts about the foundations. So the foundation for chairwork, the foundation for chairwork psychotherapy are the 4 orienting principles. And the first is multiplicity of self. It's clinically useful to understand people as containing different parts, modes, voices, or selves. I would say parenthetically, certainly multiplicity of self is at the heart of schema mode therapy. And it's kind of my hope that we can get multiplicity of self into cognitive therapy. It's certainly implied. I think David Burns, you can see him talking about different voices in different chairs. But I think cognitive therapy has not yet fully embraced a model of multiplicity. But I think that would be really very useful for that particular therapy. The second, it's healing and transformative for people to give voice to these different parts. The third, it's also healing and transformative for people to enact or reenact scenes from the past, the present, or the future. And the ultimate goal of chairwork, and I think really the ultimate goal of all of psychotherapy, is the strengthening of the ego, the healthy adult mode, or the inner leader. A little history. As many of you know, Dr. Jacob Moreno is the creator of psychodrama, and it's Dr. Moreno who created chairwork. But chairwork, as we come to know it, is really the work of Frederick or Fritz Perls, the creator of Gestalt therapy. Starting in the early 1950s, going to the early 1960s, Perls sort of worked with Moreno. And it's here that Perls learns chairwork from Moreno. But in my opinion, Perls takes chairwork beyond what Moreno had envisioned and really turns into what I would call a psychotherapeutic art form. Following Perls' death in 1970, many sort of integrative therapists took chairwork, they re-envisioned it, they applied it in different ways. So we really have a body of like 50 or even maybe almost 60 years of chairwork practice. In 2018, I discovered the 4 dialogues. And the 4 dialogues was essentially a crystallization of 50 years or 55 years of practice. And what I found was that we can understand chairwork really consists of basically 4 core dialogue stances. That all of chairwork can be done using one of these stances or various combinations of these 4 stances. So the good news is, if you want to learn how to practice chairwork, there are only 4 things you need to learn. You don't need to learn 10,000 things. You only need to learn 4 things. Having said that, there's a simplicity to this, but there's also great depth to each of these 4 things. The first one is giving voice. So you might say to a patient, I'd like to invite you to move to this chair, and I would like you to speak from your heart and speak from your pain. So we might consider this when patients say things like, there is a deep grief within me. Maybe move to this chair and speak from your sorrow. Or there's a part of me that wants to cut myself as soon as I leave the session. Can I talk to this part? Can I better understand the part that wants to do the cutting? This connects us to Gestalt awareness practices, and it connects us to voice dialogue. Also connects us to the paradoxical theory of change. Arnold Besser, a Gestalt therapist, wrote that the way to change is to more deeply be yourself. Giving voice is the heart of the work. Nothing else is needed. Dr. Rollo May said, the experience of despair may well lead to the deepest insight and most valuable change. So it is the more deeply we experience or express an emotion or going deeply into something, that by itself can lead to change. This is a core belief in Gestalt therapy that is really not embraced by other therapies, but more profoundly experiencing an emotion, delving into a part, that in and of itself is transformative. So another way of using giving voice, the giving voice stance, is existential intentionality. So there are times in a patient's life or in our lives when we make a decision, when we say yes to something, we say no to something else, we choose a path. And I often like people to stand behind the chair and kind of claim this personal authority, claim this decision. Mary Donqua, in her memoir on depression, wrote, "That was the day, the first time ever in my life that I made a commitment to being alive. Not the first time I said I wanted to live or dreamed about living. It was the first time I made a commitment that I gave myself my word." So giving voice allows us to amplify and give expression to a feeling, enables us to interview a part to better understand it, and empowers people to claim personal authority and affirm the decisions they are making in their lives. Excuse me. The second one of these is storytelling. Robertson Holmes wrote, "At the heart of any therapeutic encounter, there is always a story." I might say to a patient, "I sense that holding this secret inside for so long has been a terrible burden. If you're willing, I'd like you to move to this chair and tell me the story of what happened." So we might consider this when a patient says, "There are stories within me that I've never been shared," or "I told a few people about the accident when it occurred, but I do not feel like I ever really talked it through." The third one is internal dialogues. And here you might say to a patient, "You seem to be of two minds about the project. I wonder if you're willing to go to this chair and speak from the part that wants to go forward, and then to this chair and speak from the part that is having second thoughts." So here we're using two chairs and we're giving voice to different parts of the self. So the patient might say, "I'm conflicted about the situation," some sort of inner dialogue. "I have a deep fear of elevators. I'm afraid that I will be trapped in one and die there." So here we have cognitive distortion and rational response, cognitive restructuring. "I have this voice in my head that keeps telling me how bad I am," inner critic on the one hand, healthy adult mode on the other. And typically this takes one of three forms, what I call polarity dialogues, when different parts of basically different values get to speak. Alternative dialogues, which is more like cognitive restructuring, something where a view we're holding and then a new alternative view. Or mode dialogues, where different parts of the self can speak with each other and look at their relationships. And relationships and encounters. So you might say to a patient, "I sense that you're still very stuck, even though the relationship ended 2 years ago. I'd like to work this if I may. I'd like you to imagine her sitting in this chair, and I'd like you to talk to her and tell her what you're feeling." The patient can sit in one chair, they can imagine a person from the past, the present, and the future, and they can speak to that person. So you might say, "I know it's been 3 years, I'm still grieving the death of my mother," right? A grief and loss dialogue. And in grief work, chair work is a very standard practice, actually. Or, "My father's very cruel to all of us when I was growing up. I'm still very angry about that. Mistreatment or trauma." Or, "My sister is just impossible. I feel responsible for her, but she's driving me crazy." Difficult relationship. And the heart of this is expressing emotions. Expressing love, expressing anger, expressing fear, expressing sorrow and grief in some way. So some examples, making decisions. So patients come to us because they want to make a decision, need to make a decision, or a decision arises in the therapeutic journey. So many decisions are about polarities, right? Different values, different parts of the self that are in some sort of conflict. What is my duty to myself? What are my duty to others? How much time do I give to work? How much time do I give to family? Do I choose growth or do I choose safety? In my practice, that's a major dialogue, right? Growth versus safety. Should I be realistic or should I be idealistic? Should I stay or should I leave? And here, each chair can represent a side of the argument. I want to stay in my current job. I want to take the new job. But chair work helps us get a clearer sense of the emotional valence of each side. It's not just an intellectual exercise. We get more to the heart of things. So a patient had run a successful business in the past, but at one point the economy shifted and he shut his business down. He's now working for an institution that he was very ambivalent about. He said he wanted to go out and start another business, right? He said, I've done it before. I don't like the job, don't like the boss. I want to go out. I want to start a new business. Sounds good, but he doesn't actually do it. So this signaled there was an impasse inside of him. In Chairwork, we were able to clearly give voice to both sides. So part of him said, I want to go out. So I don't like the boss, don't like the money, don't like the commute. I want to go out. I want to start a business. I've done it before. I can do it again. But another part was very worried about money and said, I'm getting older. I want to retire at some point. I want to protect my assets. I want to stay in this job. So I had him go back and forth between the two chairs. I want to go out. I want to stay. Brought him to the middle. I said, where are you? He said, I want to stay. And he essentially went from a 50-50 impasse to a 75-25 resolution. It didn't mean he suddenly loved the job, but he definitely resolved this conflict. Right? It was a major shift from this work. That's a form of internal dialogue. Grief and loss. Bell Hooks, who's a social theorist in America, wrote a book about love. And in this book, she wrote about an emotional loss that she went through, or a romantic loss that she went through. And she said, at the time, I was often overwhelmed by grief so profound, it seemed as though an immense sea of pain was washing my heart and soul away. In my head, I engaged in imaginary conversations about the meaning of love with him. So what Bell Hooks is telling us is that people have conversations with people who are not physically present, right? And we know this is especially true when somebody's actually died. So when we ask people to engage in these kind of chairwork dialogues, we are not asking them to engage in some sort of strange behavior. We're actually asking them to engage in something they are probably already doing, but they're probably not doing it in a way that's clinically effective. A woman and her husband had a baby. The baby had a heart condition. When the baby was about a year old, the doctor said we should do surgery. They did an operation and it was unsuccessful, and the baby died consequent to the operation. And the mother plunged into a deep state of guilt and grief and blamed herself for the death of this child. She entered essentially a pathological mourning state, and she was trapped there for 16 years. In the late 60s, she goes to a Gestalt workshop. The therapist says, I want you to sit in this chair and imagine your baby in the chair opposite and talk to your baby. Mother goes, baby, I'm so sorry. I'm a terrible mother. I made a mistake. I killed you. I murdered you. All this depression and guilt and grief come pouring out. Then the therapist says, now why don't you come over here and be your baby and let your baby speak. And you would think that people would control what comes out of their mouth when they do this. But in fact, all kinds of things emerge you would not expect. When the baby spoke, the baby said, I wanted to live a full life. I did not want my heart condition to hold me back. I would have made the same decision you made. You did the right thing, even though I died. Wow. Where did that come from? Can you come back over here? Could you be your mother again? Can you take in what your child just said? And there's kind of almost like a physical release with this mother crying. And she finally says, she can release this and say goodbye to the baby. And it was these kinds of extraordinary healing stories that emerged in the 1960s that made chairwork so famous. A story from Spain. A man was so distraught over the death of his son that he made several suicide attempts. He was also having hallucinations about bringing his son back from the dead. So in the hospital, they did chairwork. They invited him to sit in one chair, imagine his son in the chair opposite, and speak from his grief and talk to his son. Then they did role reversal where they switched roles, had the father now switch chairs and become his son. And when he became his son, the son said, Dad, I want you to stay alive. I want you to care for the family. I want you to care for my other brothers. This encounter was so powerful that the man gave up his suicidal ideation, suicidal plans, and began his recovery journey. Profoundly transforming. This example of relationships and encounters. Voice dialogue. Voice dialogue is a kind of a marriage of Gestalt therapy and Jungian analysis. And it was created by Dr. Helen Cedra Stone. It's a very deep practice. I'm going to give you a very light version of it right now, but I think it's very, very helpful, and it's a form of chairwork. So voice dialogue is a belief in multiplicity of self, seeing people as having different parts, and seeing these parts as different kind of energy patterns that each have their own history, their own values, and their own purpose. So voice dialogue can include giving voice to different parts that exist within the self, while also creating a self-witnessing mode in centers. We're going to have center, we're going to go out to a chair, come back to center. So in voice dialogue, they call it a facilitator, but the therapist is basically going to interview a part. We're going to take a non-judgmental stance. We're going to seek to understand this part, ask about the part's history, its values and its purpose, and its role in the patient's life. There's no agenda to fix or change the part, and the part does not dialogue with other parts. All parts are welcome. So this is kind of where you kind of also do research on a part, explore, understand, engage with, but not fix or change. So the person starts in center, they come in with a part to work with, or the part emerges in therapeutic encounter, they move to the other chair, the therapist interviews the part. Interview is finished, the patient comes back to center, the patient reflects on the experience and on the kind of relationship they have with that part, and also the kind of relationship they want to have with that part, right? And typically in voice dialogue, you do another round, and then you do 2 cycles, and then you're finished. So these are from my colleague Arnold Arntz and Guido Jacob for the schema therapist. So Sabine, as a patient, has been speaking about a protective wall that exists inside of her, some sort of detached protector mode. Therapist, Sabine, you've been talking about the wall that protects you. If you're willing, I would like you to move to this chair and let the wall speak. Sabine moves over, she becomes the wall. She says, since I came into Sabine's life, she finally has some peace and quiet. I help to keep her safe. Therapist, why did you come into her life? I first came into her life because her father would get aggressive and threaten her. I would shut everything down so she could survive. Later on, her classmates were cruel to her, so I continued to shut things down. Therapist, sounds like you really helped her to survive. Sabine, I did. So with all these coping modes, and we see a lot of these in access 2 disorders, the question now becomes, do you want this wall as active as it's been? Help you survive? Do you still need it? Or now can you rely more on the healthy adult mode, et cetera, to cope? So that's kind of the beginning of a process, right? We explore, understand the protector mode better here. Broadly speaking, voice dialogue might be useful when we want to better understand a mode or a part, like we just saw. We lack clarity about a problem. We don't understand what to do. It's not clear. We can do voice dialogue, better explain something, right? Or the patients from a culture or subculture that we're not familiar with. It gives us a way to work with parts. We don't have to fix anything, but yet even this process is healing in and of itself. Or the patient is highly autonomous and very resistant to being in a directed form of therapy. Looking at ACT for a minute and diffusion, I think in ACT, the central diffusion technique is teaching the patient to say things like, I'm aware that there is a part of me that is frightened, rather than saying, I am frightened. With giving voice or in voice dialogue, patients can begin in center and then move to different chairs to give voice to the different parts. And when this is finished, they move back to center. And here the leader can say things like, I am the inner leader, or I'm the healthy adult mode, and this is my life. There is a part of me that is frightened. It is a part of me, but it is not all of me. I am the inner leader, and this is my life. And we've also had the experience now of space where we've actually moved that part physically away. So I think there's a nice overlap between voice dialogue and diffusion. And this is, of course, an example of giving voice. Difficult experiences. Glenn Close, who is the actor who's done a great deal with mental health issues, she's got many people in her family who have severe mental illness. She said, in our stories lies our salvation. Finding the courage to tell our stories will save lives. So one thing we've been doing for a long time in transformational chairwork is trauma-centered storytelling and repetitive storytelling. So a patient has a trauma or a secret narrative or something, we invite them to move to another chair, tell the story, tell part of the story, whatever you want to do today. When they finish, get up, move around, shake it off, sit down, and tell the story again. Tell it again, get up, move around, shake it off, sit down, tell the story again. Finish, get up, move around, breathe a little bit, sit down, tell the story again. Get up, move around, sit down, tell the story again. 4 or 5 times in a row. So as you can imagine, this is a highly emotional, it's exposure therapy really, but very powerful emotional experience. So what you begin to find is that patients begin to tell more details about the story as they're doing this work. And as they give more details, it means they're now integrating the story, right? Which is many ways what PTSD is about is PTSD is the story is trying to get into consciousness and the mind is trying to keep the story away, right? Even back to 1895 Freud, you can see the same kind of model. The other thing I've learned is that talking to patients is that therapists, they say therapists don't want to hear the stories, right? Therapists avoid trauma stories. And I worked in a trauma study for 3 years. And I certainly understand that when you hear these stories, you want to cringe, you want to protect yourself, you want to, hold yourself tight. These are very disturbing stories. But when you do repetitive storytelling, what happens is that the therapist begins to habituate to the story, right? That we get used to it, feel less frightened. We feel a little more relaxed. We can breathe a little bit more, which gives us the freedom to ask questions, even to ask intimate questions about things that happened in the story. So the patient is getting some sort of integration, and the therapist is gaining freedom. So everybody gains. But as I'm saying this, I suspect that some of you are thinking, this sounds really intense. What about re-traumatization, things like that? Well, obviously you need to use your clinical judgment. But lately I've been very impressed by the work of my colleagues Eckhard Roediger, Bruce Stevens, and Robert Brockman. Right? And they have done what I call three-person storytelling. So there are three ways to tell a story. First person is what I just said. You move a person to a chair, and you say, tell the story in the first person. I was in a car accident, and these are some of the things that happened to me. What I really come to like is what I call third person storytelling. You move to a chair and tell me the story of what happened, but talk about yourself in the third person. So if the patient's name is John, John sits there and goes, John was in a car accident. These are some of the things that happened to him. This is a remarkably powerful way of doing trauma work. Right? It's easier for the patient, but there can be a lot of emotion, a lot of processing, right? And also, if there's issues of guilt or self-blame in the story, it helps the patient get more space from that. So they get the freedom to kind of go into difficult things because they're talking about somebody else. Right? Second person storytelling is kind of in the middle between the two. And here you do two chairs. The patient sits in one chair, they imagine themselves in the chair opposite, and they tell themselves what happened. John, you were in a car accident, and I understand that these are some of the things that happened to you. And here you work with the patient to speak to themselves in a way that's filled with compassion and filled with empathy. So I especially like this third person storytelling. Perhaps you will try it. It's quite amazing. Going back to Dr. Moreno with catharsis, he said, every true second time is a liberation from the first. If we repeat an experience and we really connect with the emotional release, we will begin to heal. And this is a form of storytelling, of course. Schema restructuring, so this is more in the CBT world. This is work from Jeff Young. Ivy had a self-sacrifice schema. That means she puts the needs of others before her own in a problematic way, right? Not just in kind of a moral way, but kind of beyond that. It's causing her to feel frustrated and depressed. She's being activated with her friend Adam. So when she's with him, they focus on his life and his challenges. Even though he asks about what's going on with her, she feels very blocked, doesn't feel okay talking, returns the focus back on him. So her self-sacrifice scheme is blocking her from sharing her own issues and her own concerns. So she does a dialogue with Jeff. One side is the schema side. It says, don't be selfish. His needs are more important than you. He should talk and you should listen. And then they co-create a healthy side, which says relationships are based on reciprocity. I should listen to him and he should listen to me. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And then finally, when she's in the healthy side, she gets angry at the other schema. And that, of course, is the sign that the healing is beginning to take place. And then moving from CBT to schema therapy, she then closes her eyes and does imagery work, goes back to childhood where she gets the origin of the schema, which is her mother who used to say, basically parentifies her and says, you should be taking care of me and not me taking care of you. So now she, in the imagery, she now has a dialogue with the mother and says, it costs me too much to take care of you. It costs me my sense of self, right? Another way of doing this, cost-benefit analysis, looking at coping modes. So coping modes are not really like they're sort of true or not true. It's more like, are they useful or not useful? And the general feeling about coping modes is they were historically useful. They help people survive. That's why they use them. But the question is whether their current manifestation is helpful or problematic. So here we can create a list of the positives of the coping mode and the negatives of the coping mode and use this as a foundation for our chairwork dialogue. So, Nicole has a bully and attack mode, which means she's very aggressive with other people, right? So what are the benefits of her bullying and attack mode? Other people will respect me as they're afraid of me. And perhaps the most important one, I can make sure that no one will abuse and hurt me, right? I've been hurt, I've been taken advantage of in the past. That is not going to happen again. What are the costs? Others are afraid of me. That's why they don't like me. That means I'm isolated. That means my life is filled with loneliness. And I keep getting in trouble with the law. I have problems with the police. I'm going to lose my freedom. So we go back and forth between I will be strong, I will be safe, no one's going to hurt me, and I'm going to have a lonely life and I'm going to lose my freedom. Right? And we go back and forth. And out of that, we can then move to the next step of the mode dialogue, where the healthy adult mode can speak to the bully and attack overcompensation mode. See, can we find a new relationship? Is the healthy adult mode now strong enough to be assertive, to claim power, that she doesn't need to be so prepared to fight? Right? So that's kind of how we move forward with that. And these are internal dialogues, different parts of the self engaged in some way. So these are all models that just give you kind of using one dialogue to solve a problem. But, and that often is all you need to do. But sometimes you need to do more things. Right? So we're looking at some complex dialogues. So complex emotions. Freud argued that the heart of the human experience is ambivalence. And what I call a vector dialogue, or this is a three-chair dialogue, we can work with relational ambivalence and we can work with relational complexity. So two ways to do this. So Pearl's talked about appreciations and resentments, and always was focused on people expressing both sides, right? He was playing with this idea of ambivalence. So for example, a patient, when I was growing up, my father was an alcoholic. And then when I was 20, he stopped drinking, became sober, and now he's been sober for 20 years. And now he's my best friend and a great grandfather to my kids. So I have these memories, the memories of an alcoholic father destroying our house and screaming and yelling and being a tyrant, and this great man who's my friend. Right? So here we can use three chairs, patient in one chair, the good object or the good memories of the current father in one chair, and the bad memories of the alcoholic father in the other one. And he can talk to both of these parts and kind of separate these memories out so they're not confused. We separate them out, right? Does that for a while, then you can step back into this inner leader thing and just kind of reflect on that experience. So we engage with it, we step back and reflect, right? This is a great way to process these very difficult emotions, especially important when people, with people who have died, right? Often there's a lot of in grief, confusion about different complicated experiences, or I love these things, I hated these things about you. One way to do that. Another way is the other way is splitting the self, where we can express to someone else our negative and positive feelings, right? So here we have two chairs for the patient and one chair for the external object of the person. These are things I love about you, and this is I'm angry about you, right? So looking at marital relationships, other intimate relationships, we can express, these different parts of ourselves and get a chance to let them out. And again, step back and reflect on the balance between these things. So this is an example of both internal dialogues and relationships encounters coming together in a dialogue. The next one is inner critic. So I put this book here by Hal and Cedra Stone for a specific reason. I'll come back to that in a second. James and Catherine Elliott developed a psychotherapy model called empathetic dialogues, which is kind of like an REBT chairwork form, sort of very sort of philosophical cognitive model. And they said, inside of each of us is a negative influence that is responsible for 99% of our psychological problems. That negative influence is the inner critic. This is a long story here, but I'm just going to cut to the chase. We look at the inner critic literature, we find there are two models of the inner critic. The older model said, the inner critic is an internalization of abusive, figures in the patient's life, early life, parents, teachers, whatever it was. And these voices live inside the person, and they can be hostile, they can be malevolent, they can be malignant. And you see this in the borderline world, you see this in people who've been highly traumatized. But the Stones have argued that the inner critic actually develops, early on in a patient's life. as a kind of a protector mode. It's there to keep the patient safe. And it's actually very, very anxious. Right? So one question is, which kind of inner critic are we working with? So here we again move to voice dialogue. Ask the patient, why don't you move to this chair and be your critic, and let me talk to your critic, right? So we want to understand its origins and its purpose, and we all understand its core value. And I got this from the work of Leslie Greenberg. I think this is very important. Whenever there's a criticism, there is always a value, right? Self-criticism, other criticism, there's always a value, and somebody is not meeting that value. So you want to go, what is the value? Why is this important? So if the critic is saying to Susie, you're too fat, you got to lose weight, I would say to the critic, why do you care if Susie loses weight? What difference does it make? And I will push the critic to explain to me why it matters. And what you eventually get to is, I want Susie to lose weight because otherwise she will be teased and rejected by other people. Okay, so it's an anxiety driven. If it's an internalized oppressor, it may say something like, she's a fat, disgusting pig, and I think and I wish she would die, right? Then you get a sense of which critic you're working with. If it is a malevolent critic, your basic strategy is to tell the patient you are not to listen to that voice, and we kind of work together to fight off the voice and say, you are evil, you're not on my side. But if it's an anxiety voice, and that's much more common in North America, we want to work to understand the underlying fears and anxieties. We affirm, I can see that you've been useful and you have good intentions, or in the patient's life, but how is it working now? Right? And often it's missed the mark, and it's causing all kinds of problems for the patient at the present time. And often the critic will say, yeah, it's not working, right? So now we bring over another chair, and the patient move to that and become the healthy adult mode. In the healthy adult mode, and the inner critic will have a dialogue that go back and forth. But fundamentally, you want the healthy adult to say, this is my life. It is not your life. Okay? And we begin to shift the power from the inner critic to the healthy adult mode. Right? So we look at, what are the values of the inner critic? What are the goals of the inner critic? What are the values of the healthy adult mode? Do they share the same values? Often they do, but sometimes they don't, or sometimes the healthy adult has other values. Because the inner critic is very frightened and very focused on survival, right? So, and you want to shift, how much power can you take into the healthy adult mode, into the inner leader, and now turning the inner critic into kind of a coach, or using its gifts to kind of help make a team with the healthy adult to go forward. And these are examples of mode dialogues. The inner leader, the healthy adult mode, speaking to different parts of the self. Just another version of this, another way to work with this. Paul Chadwick in England, CBT therapist who works with severely mentally ill patients in the UK. He says these patients have very, very negative self-concepts, and you are not likely to persuade them that these are distortions. So what he essentially does is make a list of all their negative thoughts about themselves. I'm fat, lazy, ugly, stupid, useless, and I never should have been born. And then they co-create a positive alternative script. Have you ever done anything kind, anything generous, anything courageous? You ever accomplished anything, right? I gave my mother flowers on Mother's Day. I shared my lunch with Tom. I took care of Susie's cats. I write for Amnesty International. And so we kind of work with that. And I put the chairs facing in the same direction, right? So they stand behind one chair and they say the negative things. I'm fat, lazy, ugly, stupid, useless, and I never should have been born. They move to the other chair. I'm kind, loving, compassionate, caring, and I write for Amnesty International. Back to the first one. I'm fat, lazy, ugly, stupid, useless. Second chair. I'm kind, loving, compassionate, caring. Back to the first. I'm fat, lazy, ugly, stupid, useless. Second chair. I'm kind, loving, compassionate, caring. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth many times. And what we're doing here is creating complexity of self. That when this patient entered therapy, they were a bad person. But now through this process, they are now a bad person, but they are also now a good person. We're creating an alternative self inside. And we know from the research that inner complexity is associated with better mental health. The reason the chairs face in the same direction is because the negative self is very, very strong, right? The good self is very fragile. I do not want a direct engagement, right? So you don't want to do disputation work here, right? You want to keep these parts separate and have the person go back and forth. And I actually write out these scripts and I keep them, and every week I have the patient do it again and do it again. And I watch as the percentages shift. It might be, 70-30 the first time with negative 70, positive 30, 60-40 the next, 55-45. It's an amazingly powerful and amazingly dramatic way to work with people, right? But again, you want to keep the voices separate because the positive is not strong enough. That negative has been there for a long time. So here we see both giving voice and internal dialogues. And then one last one, interpersonal mistreatment and trauma. So these are ways of working with trauma or these kind of stories using all four of the dialogues. And you can use just one of these or any combination of these four. Just want to run you through them. So telling the story, we saw this before, right? So using the various storytelling strategies, either first person repetitive or third person or second person. Relationships and encounters. So here we have chairs for the people involved. We express anger and fear and distress and sorrow. Right? So chair, we can speak and nurture the abused chair in one chair. In another chair, we can confront the abuser. In a third chair, we can confront those who knew and did not protect the child. Often patients are most angry at those people. And here, both the patient and the therapist can speak to the person in the other chair. And I think it's especially important that the therapist speak with the child. Often patients are very harsh on the child. They have no sympathy or empathy for the child. Right? That's where we can step in. And a little bit different from imagery or scripting, where you can actually change the story. When I speak to a child in a chair, what I say to the child is, I know what you are going through. I understand what's happening to you, and I feel deeply and profoundly distressed by that. I cannot fix it. I cannot change it, but I am here, I am with you, and you are not alone. And one of the most powerful things, even socially for people who are oppressed or people, is to know that they are not alone. I do not suggest you say to the patient, everything will be okay. That is not a good thing to tell the child, so they won't believe you. Right? In an imagery or scripting, which I also do, you can then change the narrative. But in the chair work, I think it's about, I am here, I am with you, I know you are seen and you are heard. Right? So I think it's a powerful way of working with this. And also, it's generally best not to have the person play the role of abuser. I would not do a role reversal and have them be in the abuser chair. Emotional abuse is an example. So here we can fight back. We can repudiate the toxic messages that were given to them and affirm themselves and validate the needs they had as children. Jeff Young often talks about sort of this early emotional disconnection that the parents do not understand the needs of children and they do not understand the developmental capacities of children. And that leads to these kind of early maladaptive schemas. Patient puts her grandmother in the chair and says, you are so mean. I hate you. I do love you, but I hate you. I hate being here with you. You constantly talk about dying and death. Death, that's it, every day, every day. I resent the times you called me a tramp, she says. I was never a tramp. You always said you'd become pregnant. I never did things like that. But you always said I was no good, a slut. I resent you for not trusting me, for not letting me be a young person. I resent you for dragging me to cemeteries to see dead graves. I resent that. So here this patient is expressing anger, that she probably could not express when she was living with her grandmother. Right? Jeff Young again says, when things go wrong in childhood, an early maladaptive schema is created, and anger is the way to heal it. And anger is very central in schema therapy. But therapists often don't like to be around anger. I understand it. So with chair work, you can actually sit next to the patient. They can express their anger in the other direction. So you're not getting the anger towards you. But I would also add, I think that the ultimate healing here is sorrow. That you could put the grandmother in the chair and say, we had an opportunity to love each other and care for each other. And all you talked about was sex and death. And you criticized me. And we lost an opportunity. And I think that grief is where the deepest healing takes place. But anger may be on that journey together. Internal dialogues. Andrea was gang raped, and she said, I used to be this lively, happy girl, ready to take on the world. I was so excited about starting college. I knew good things were ahead of me. But now I'm a scared, lonely, and ugly girl inside and out. I have no ambition. All I care about is being left alone so I can be safe. So this is a kind of cognitive restructuring here. And I'm sort of drawing on some ideas from cognitive processing therapy. So my understanding that Patricia Resick has said, so this with adult trauma, that we have a schema about the world. We see the world a certain kind of way. A trauma takes place. And now we develop a new schema that's a trauma-based schema that's very extreme in its interpretations and it's very emotional. And she says that what keeps PTSD going is the disconnection between the old schema and the new schema. So adapting these ideas, I put these into chairs. How did you see the world before the trauma? How do you see the world after, right? So a patient might say, before the trauma, I trusted 90% of the people in the world, and I thought 10% were evil, or 90% were good and 10% were evil. After the trauma, 95% of the people in the world are evil, and 5% are good, maybe, right? So we have people go back and forth, the old view, the new view. 90% are good, 95% are evil, back and forth and back and forth. Then come to the third place, and what do you make of this? What's the balance? How do you see this? And they go, well, I could say 50% are good and 50% are evil, right? So here we've seen a shifting in the schema, and this will reduce symptoms, right? And maybe find a new way to become in the world that sort of integrates both experiences. This is very, very powerful, needless to say, right? And this is a very interesting way to do this. The other thing that's interesting from a CBT perspective is normally in CBT, the patient's got a schema or some sort of belief that's problematic, and we kind of co-create an alternative belief, and we confront the new belief confronts the old belief. But here, actually, the old belief confronts the new belief. The old belief is the healing belief. So that's an interesting kind of reversal for things. And lastly, giving voice, right? So the Gouldings created something called redecision therapy, which was really a precursor to schema therapy. And they emphasize that we make decisions early in our lives because of the traumas or difficulties or whatever we've experienced, and we live our life that way. But when we come to therapy, at some point we want to make a new decision, or they would call a redecision, changing your life, giving up a symptom, right? Giving up various behaviors, right? If you're living in fear, claiming courage. If you're cutting yourself, you stop. If you're drinking too much, you stop drinking. Whatever it is you're doing, I give up the symptom, I claim authority, right? So I will no longer live this way. I will heal from the damage. I'm now choosing a new, healthier, more self-affirming way to live, and I am claiming power and personal authority. So 3 women they worked with, these 3 separate women. One said, from now on, I'm going to find trustworthy people, and I will trust them. Everyone is not like you. Or I enjoy sex today in spite of what you did to me. You are no longer in my bed. Or I can laugh and jump and dance without guilt because fun didn't cause you to rape me. It was your perversity. Okay? So beautiful. This is more the later part of therapy. Okay? But you've seen now 4 different ways of using the dialogues to work with trauma. So how does chair work heal? So just some thoughts I'm thinking about. Why does this work? How does this work? Working with chairs brings greater clarity to the parts, which leads to greater control over them. It facilitates encounters and dialogues among the parts that might not occur naturally. Promotes high levels of affect and emotional expression, which facilitate both cognitive restructuring and the resolution of traumatic experiences. And it can trigger creative processes within the individual that can lead to new life solutions. So with that, I always like to thank the masters, Dr. Moreno, Dr. Pearls, and Zerka Moreno, Dr. Moreno's wife, for this extraordinary gift of chair work. And so with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kellogg. What an amazing presentation you just gave us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with all of us here in Latin America. And now we'll go briefly to a short question and answer session. The first question I have here for you is that, as you know, due to COVID, we were all kind of forced to go online, to do online interventions. And a lot of people were not prepared to work with online interventions. And in the case of chair work and these kind of experiential interventions. Are there any suggestions or adaptations therapists could consider in a way to use them in a safety way?
So our group actually created sort of guidelines for using chair work in teletherapy. So I actually can send those to you and you can just post them for the group. But actually, chair work is very, very good with Zoom. So it's actually because, chair work, as we often say, chair work is not about chairs. It's about giving voice to parts and enacting or reenacting, stories in the past, present, or future. So moving a little bit is enough, right? Or moving to the other side, right? And then coming back to center. So it's center. So micro movements shift the person and shift the energy. But for other things, you can actually have people stand up. You can actually get the chairs. You can move back a little bit with the camera. I'm a little too close here. But you can do that full thing. But even these micro movements shifts the person. So it's been, I didn't know that, but it's been amazingly effective with chairs. So you can move more and have them move the camera, so there are all kinds of ways to do this, but it's the shifting breaks things. It doesn't have to be 10 feet. It can be a foot, right? Although, for an inner critic, you might want to move it a little bit further, but you can play with the space. But yeah, it works very well with Zoom. And I actually find, strangely, I think it's more effective for some patients than actually face-to-face, because as I'm looking at you and you're looking at me, it's very focused. There's a very intense quality. Now, for some therapists, they don't like that, and that's not what they want to do. But for chair work, we're really getting into intensity. It actually can really heighten things. So that's an answer, I guess.
Those are certainly great tips for people watching us during this presentation. On the same line, are there any risks or disadvantages people using chair work in an online version of it should consider when using the technique?
You have to, chair work it's a deceptively simple technique, right? It looks very simple in many ways. Excuse me. It is very emotionally powerful, and it's very emotionally powerful online. So you just need to use the same judgment you would use if it was face to face. You want, I think there's a window of arousal or something people talk about. You want, certain lots of emotion, but you obviously want to flood people. You want to make sure you don't start something heavy, like with 10 minutes left in your session. So you got to use the same guidelines, but using your clinical judgment, you should be fine. So people often ask me, when do I do chair work for the first time, right? And I always do chair work in the very first session. So the very first time I meet somebody, I do a long session, which I think is a very good idea. So when you do a longer session, you get a greater bonding. So they're more likely to become your patient. So economically, that's a good idea. But beyond that, I give them time. We actually do chair work. They have time to debrief it. And this is an issue really for schema therapists, but maybe other therapists would be interested. If you are an experiential therapist, if you're doing schema therapy, right, you absolutely must not compromise on the experiential techniques. So if a patient comes to see you, they have to do imagery and they have to do chair work, or they shouldn't be your patient. Because if you were going to be an experiential therapist, if you say, well, I won't do it, then you've just killed yourself. You can't do your therapy. Now, if you say, I also do CBT, then you can switch to CBT and do something else if that works. But if you are into chair work, you have to say, I'm going to fight for the chair work. But having said that, you can say, but tell me about your anxieties. Tell me about your fears. Or if you want to be funny, you go, why don't you go to this chair and speak from the part that doesn't want to do chair work, and then speak from this. Yeah, you can be playful with it. So I'm not insensitive. Nobody's ever left my practice because of that. But I've learned you have to, if you believe in chair work, you have to not compromise on it. But you be gentle. You can do it very gently, work very slowly.
I have one more question for you. This is very interesting. So actually, I have a lot of questions, but due to the time, I have one more. Okay. As you just mentioned, all these chair work are very emotionally powerful techniques. In the case of online interventions, do you have any suggestions in case of, let's say, technical issues, or maybe our connection goes down, or how to handle these kind of situations that may be not that controllable in the online version of it?
So I've been having this funny experience, which is completely non-scientific. I know you're doing a scientific conference, but I find that when people say things that are very emotional, my Zoom keeps freezing and crashing. So I don't know whether Zoom cannot tolerate high levels of emotion. It's like weird and bizarre, but it happens to me all the time. But anyway, other than that, I've never had this problem. Basically just reboot, come back in. So I haven't found a technical issue with Zoom. But I do find that something about high levels of emotion, maybe the system, just the way it processes it in North America, it's a weird thing, but it happens enough that I think something must be up, maybe technically with the Zoom. But I have very profound, experiences. We just did a training in Brazil. We did training in Russia now. We went to very deep places with people. It was really quite astonishing. So, you want to have a good internet connection. And I guess if you don't have good internet, you should wait and not do it till you can find one that works better. Because you don't want to be crashing in the middle of a trauma story. You don't want the patient to disappear on you. You don't want to disappear on the patient. But in general, that's not really been an issue for me. So.
Okay, thank you for sharing all your knowledge with us. We could actually stay all day hearing and learning from you, but unfortunately, it is time to close our presentation. Scott, we don't have words to thank you for your availability, your generosity, this so practical presentation you just gave us, that it will certainly give an impactful contribution to all of us today. Thank you so much. Now we are going to continue to our symposium schedule.